All rise, fearful away. Please be seated.
Mr. McCloskey, you may proceed.
Thank you. On the evening of 13 July, Mladić drove away from the Srebrenica area and stopped by the Drina Corps command in Vlasenica, where he held a small ceremony announcing the promotion of General Krstić as commander of the Drina Corps and the retirement of General Jivanović. Mladić then drove on to his HQ at Crna Rijeka near Han Pijesak. Mladić and Tolomir left Main Staff Chief of Security Colonel Bejara in Bratunac the evening of the 13th. Bejara spent much of the evening organizing the burial of the 1,000 men who were killed at the Kravica warehouse that day. Bejara also oversaw the first movements of prisoners from Bratunac to schools in the Zvornik area that night, the evening of the 13th. The first group of prisoners arrived at the Orahovac school late on the 13th. However, the vast majority of the men held around Bratunac were held overnight in Bratunac to be transported on the 14th. Now, on the 14th, Mladić spent the night of the 13th at his command post and remained at the HQ on the 14th for a good part of the day working before traveling to Belgrade. On the morning of the 14th, thousands of Muslims held in buildings and vehicles in Bratunac were transported in a huge convoy to the Zvornik area, where they were put in schools and public buildings, including Orahovac, Petkovci, Ročević, and Pilica. Here is a map graphic to show you the areas I'm talking about. This map graphic will help you understand where these towns are located in relation to one another and the front line. Which is depicted again in the purple thick line there. You will also see the red arrows at the bottom of the page, which indicate the route of the Muslim column. The VRS began the organized and systematic executions in a field near the Orahovac school on the afternoon of 14 July. At the time the murders were going on, Mladić was traveling by car from Crna Rijeka to Belgrade, where he passed through Zvornik on the road you can see along the Drina River, within 10 kilometers of the Orahovac execution site, driving right by the Zvornik Brigade headquarters. Then he turned off the main road to the right, crossing a bridge over the Drina River towards Belgrade. The execution of up to 1,000 people at Orahovac finished late in the evening on the 14th. Executions started at about midnight at the Petkovci school, just north of Orahovac, where up to another 1,000 people were murdered by firing squad. This continued all through the night. During the day, on the 15th, executions continued for hundreds of Muslims being held at the Ročević school. They were transported to the banks of the nearby Drina River and executed near the town of Kozluk. One of the executioners will testify in this case. On the morning of the 15th, Beara had run out of men to carry out executions, and he called Generals Zivanovic and Krstic, requesting a squad from the Visegrad Brigade that had been ordered by, in his words, the commander, meaning Mladić. You will see an intercept of this, a direct reference to Mladić ordering a squad of soldiers for Beara on the 12th and 13th. One reason Beara did not have troops in the Zvornik area because they were being used to defend against the Muslim column from Srebrenica, approaching them from the rear. And many of the Zvornik Brigade resources were already being used in the murder operation, as we can see from the interim combat report of Vinko Pandurovic. Pandurovic starts this report out by talking about the military situation with the Muslim column approaching from the rear and the Second Corps hitting him from the front. And then he goes on to say this in pertinent part. An additional burden for us is the large number of prisoners distributed throughout schools in the brigade area, as well as obligations of security and restoration of the terrain. We know about the prisoners. When he says obligations of security, he means the obligation to guard those prisoners. The term security in Serbian, as regards the security branch, is a different word. As it's used by Pandurovic, this means security as in guarding. When he says the restoration of the terrain, the term in Serbian is asanacija, and you'll see that this is a JNA military term for cleaning up the dead and debris after a battle. So what Pandurovic is saying here is that he has this incredible burden to guard and bury the Muslims distributed in the schools. By the time he writes this on the 15th of July, all the Muslims at Arahovac are dead. All the Muslims at Petkovci are dead. The Muslims being killed at Kozluk are probably in the process at this point. That leaves about 1,500 Muslim men being guarded by Pandurovic's troops in the area of Pilica. He goes on to say, this command cannot take care of these problems any longer, as it has neither the material nor other resources. If no one takes on this responsibility, I will be forced to let them go. Now, I'm sure his comment about letting go of the prisoners from Pilica was not serious, but I'm sure it got the attention of his superiors, because on the 16th of July, Beara had obtained a unit from the main staff, the 10th Sabotage Detachment, who, along with others, murdered about 1,500 Muslims that day at the Branjevo farm near Pilica and the Pilica Cultural Center. By nightfall on the 16th, over 7,000 Muslim men and boys had been murdered by the VRS and MUD forces. As I had mentioned, General Mladić traveled to Belgrade on the 14th. He traveled to Belgrade often on army business. This was not unusual. From the evening of the 14th of July through the evening of the 16th of July, Mladić carried on VRS state business in several meetings with UNPROFOR officers and international representatives and foreign supporters. These meetings are outlined in his own notebooks or captured on video. On the 16th of July, Mladić spent some time at a wedding with his wife. However, that afternoon, Mladić conducted state business with visiting Canadian supporters at the Veterans Hospital in Belgrade, known as the VMA. Video of this meeting captures General Mladić in uniform on the telephone, conducting army business and receiving reports on the action in Žepa area and in the Zvornik Brigade. In this first video still, we'll see General Mladić and his wife at the VMA in Belgrade. In this next still, we'll see Mladić has stood up and moved to the telephone at the VMA. At trial, you'll see this video and hear General Mladić as he discusses the situation in Žepa, mentioning Vinko, who is the Vinko Pandurović, of whose report we just saw, and the situation going on in his brigade. On the evening of 16 July, Mladić returned to the main staff command at Crna Rijeka, where he met with Generals Mladić and Tolomir. That evening, General Mladić gave oral orders to main staff security officer Colonel Kasarević to go to Bratunac area on the 17th of July and command the units searching for Muslim stragglers from Srebrenica. Kasarević will testify here. Kasarević proceeded to the Bratunac area that next day. By the end of the day on the 17th, VRS and MUP forces conducting the search operation had captured 150 Muslim men. Shortly thereafter, those men were transported to an isolated spot in the Srpska Valley and summarily executed. This could not have happened without Mladić's express order. When you hear the exhumation evidence about the mass graves, you may consider whether the victims in the mass grave were battle casualties and not murder victims. This idea is absolutely absurd for several reasons. First, you will recall the many survivors of the large mass executions who lived to tell of the many hundreds of fallen men and boys they left behind at the killing field. You can see a slide of the image of Sarajevo farm the day after the murders, as they will be described to you by the survivors and Dražan Rademović. This image shows a field covered with bodies, just like the survivors will tell you, and as Rademović will tell you. Rademović estimated that about 1,200 people were murdered at the Sarajevo farm, at this very spot where you see the United States has noted bodies marked. You can see the excavator digging and probable bodies. That's where we found a large mass grave that still had 150 bodies in the very bottom of it. Secondly, many of the victims in the large mass graves were found blindfolded or with their hands tied or both. Let's go to the exhibit of the Kozluk mass grave. This is some amazing archaeology done of the horror that was created by Mladić. They pulled the dirt off the bodies as they lay, and we can see at a distance what was left. Let's go to Exhibit 32 of one of those victims. This is clearly a blindfold. This man did not die in combat. Let's go to the next shot. These are hands from the same grave, tied behind the victim's back. Thirdly, the VRS would never have gone in the woods where armed Muslims were and retrieved Muslim dead. These were dense woods, off the beaten track. Much of the area was heavily mined. There was no reason on earth for the VRS to use valuable men and equipment and search out Muslim remains and bring them back many kilometers and bury them in places like Orahovac, Petkovci, Kozluk, or Sarajevo. As I mentioned in the beginning, the murders continued beyond 16 July in places like Sarajevo on 19 July, Višina on 23 July, Trnovo on or about 25 July, and other locations we will never know. In the fall of 1995, Mladić and Karadzic decided to exhume the enormous mass graves near Orahovac, Petkovci, Kozlik, Branjevo, and Kravica, and scatter the human remains into well over 30 smaller graves, hidden in isolated areas where they hoped they could not be found by NATO or the ICTY. General Mladić himself approved the enormous amounts of fuel necessary for this task. In a document signed by General Mladić, he stated, "This is to approve 5 tons of D2 diesel fuel for carrying out engineering works. The logistics sector of the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska shall deliver the fuel to the standard barracks in Zvornik to Captain Milorad Trpić." This is Captain Milorad Trpić. This is a typo by the VRS. You may recall, I said earlier, Captain Trpić was a security officer with the Zvornik Brigade, and he was in charge of overseeing this, as you will see in the trial. With the help of witnesses and aerial imagery, most of the secondary graves, as we call them, have been found and exhumed. The original or primary graves have been connected to the secondary graves by DNA analysis, where parts of the same person has been identified in both graves. In addition, they have been connected by bullet cartridge casings, where casings fired from the same gun were found in a primary grave and a secondary grave. I will conclude now, but before I do, I want to show you one last short video segment. We have to prove criminal intent. This video helps you look into the mind of General Mladić. After the fall of Srebrenica, many Srebrenica Muslims made their way to Žepa, including a victim of the Kravica warehouse execution, witness RM 274. On 25 and 26 July, the VRS took the Žepa town and shipped out the Muslim population of Žepa, including witness 274, who was wounded. Mladić himself, along with Generals Guerrero, Krstić, and Colonel Pandorović, supervised the departure of these Muslims. I want to show you what Mladić said to the departing Muslims of Žepa, especially those identified as able-bodied men. These words should help you.
S druge strane, 3-4 tamo.
Ajmo, Vojo, ne jeđoj.
Ajde.
I
I mali Berok tamo. Tako, držite oružje oko. Poravnajte se u moju liniju, rekao sam, poravnajte se i razmakni se dalje. Tako. Dobar dan. Dugo ste slušali o meni. Sad me gledate, ja sam general Mladić. Među vama ima i vojno sposobni. Svi ste bezbedni. I sve vas prebacujemo za kladan. Želimo vam srećan put i doviđenja. Živi bili. Nemojte vi vojno sposobni ponovo na front. Nema više oproštaja. Sad vam poklanjam život. Dobar dan. Dugo su vam o meni svašta pričali. Imate mogućnost da me vidite. Ti da ćutiš. Boje da voziš u gasi glavu. Ja sam general Mladić. Među vama ima i vojno sposobni koji ste do sad na mene pucali. Svima vam opraštam i poklanjam život. nemojte više dolaziti, preda me na front. Sljedeći put nema oproštaja.
These words, I am giving you your life as a gift. You can see from this video that Mladić had contemplated the fate of the few men on these buses and considered their lives were his for the taking or for the giving. But by 25 July, accounts of atrocities in Srebrenica were being reported in the press, and Mladić could not afford to be so cavalier about murder. He had the Srebrenica secret to hide and could no longer murder young men with impunity. The world was now watching very closely, and he knew it. In conclusion, I want to take you briefly back to the victims to remind us of why we are all here in the first place. To do this, I want to share with you the words of one woman from Srebrenica, Ratko Mladić, who testified at a prior trial. Near the end of her testimony, she came back from the weekend and said this to the trial chamber. Yesterday afternoon, when I returned from here, I went out to walk around your city. That is what I wanted to tell you. I couldn't really see much, but what I really liked, what caught my eye, was a monument that we visited. And that monument was to women. That is, women awaiting sailors who never came back. And the monument to those wives touched me profoundly. I should like to find this statue and take it to Bosnia with me. Perhaps it could be likened to mothers and wives of Srebrenica, who have been waiting and hoping for all those years, except that we followed different roads. We could turn to our empty forests. We saw our sons and our husbands off to those woods and never found out anything about them again, whether they were alive or dead, where their bones were lying. Many mothers have died hoping against hope, and it is quite possible that all the mothers would end up like that because their numbers are dwindling every day. Mirsada will testify here. Mirsada lost her husband Salko, her two sons Elvir and Admir. Admir was only 16. Her father-in-law Omer, both Salko's brothers Osman and Zafir, her nephew Samir. And this was not unusual. Many suffered greater losses. Today, there are still 1,500 men and boys from Srebrenica who have not come home and may never be found. The loss of these victims and the crippling of those left behind can be simply put. It is a Bosnian genocide that we must never forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCloskey. Mr. Groom, do you think you'd conclude in approximately 45 minutes? Is that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, then we might not need another break. We may conclude at 12:15. You may proceed.
Your Honors, Mr. Mladić does not come before you today accused of being a poor soldier, a poor commander. In fact, many considered him to be a proficient, effective leader of the VRS, a formidable adversary on the battlefield. He is here today because he applied his experience and skill as a soldier, his authority as a leader, to the commission of crimes. The crimes enumerated in the indictment perpetrated against the non-Serb peoples of Bosnia were all related to a common criminal purpose. Although a criminal trial requires some dissection of the crimes, they were experienced as a single trauma by the people of Bosnia. It is important that the crimes are understood in relationship to each other. This is why the prosecution will begin the first segment of its case presentation with an overview of the crimes. A presentation that will demonstrate the relationship between the crimes and Mr. Mladić's role in the commission of them. Subsequent segments of the case will focus on the individual components of the case. The indictment sets out 4 joint criminal enterprises that cover these crimes. Here on slide 1 of part 3 of the opening is a summary of these 4 joint criminal enterprises. The first is a campaign to forcibly remove Bosnian Muslims and Croats from large areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina, areas intended for a Bosnian Serb state. A campaign that included the crime of genocide in certain municipalities. This overarching common criminal purpose was the root from which the other constituent joint criminal enterprises sprung. This overarching common criminal purpose is reflected in the territorial and demographic ambitions of the Bosnian Serb leadership. The other 3 criminal enterprises are in their essence derivative. The second joint criminal enterprise was the persistent criminal shelling and sniping of the civilians of Sarajevo to induce and maintain terror in them. The third joint criminal enterprise was the taking of UN peacekeepers and observers as hostages and using them as human shields. And lastly, the elimination of the Muslims in Srebrenica, the genocide of Srebrenica Muslims by organizing the mass executions of the older boys and men and by expelling women and children from the enclave. At all relevant times, the core members of these joint criminal enterprises shared the intent to commit these crimes. The glue that bound them together, that harmonized their individual contributions, that ensured that they worked in unison toward the common goal, was a shared criminal purpose. In addition to Mr. Mladić's participation in these several joint criminal enterprises, the prosecution asserts that he also planned, instigated, and ordered the crimes in the indictment. The indictment and the prosecution pretrial brief both set out these modes of criminal responsibility in greater detail. There are 2 primary pillars to the prosecution's case, 2 aspects which permeate the entirety of the case and establish each of the modes of criminal responsibility described in the indictment. The first is Mr. Mladić's authority and ability as a commander. He was in full command of the many people who directly perpetrated crimes in the indictment. His only superior was Radovan Karadzic. Ratko Mladić's command authority gave him the means and the ability to commit such widespread and grievous crimes. He exercised his authority to plan and order the crimes in the indictment. The second pillar is his knowledge that the crimes he planned and ordered were in fact being carried out as intended by him. The VRS inherited a fully functioning command structure and communication system from the JNA. From the first hours of its existence, from his first day as commander, channels of communication to the main staff and lines of authority from the main staff to individual soldiers in the field operated effectively. To understand Mladić's state of mind, how he would have perceived his own authority, I will ask you to consider two passages from JNA manuals. These passages reflect what he would have been taught about the concepts of command and control while he was in the JNA. The passage now on slide 2 is from the JNA textbook on command and control. It states, quote, "At this point, it is necessary to establish a distinction between control and command. These two notions are often used concurrently. However, control and command are not synonyms. There are differences in the work they do. Command is a form, function of control that exists only in a military organization. Command implements control. It comprises the right to make decisions and assign tasks. It is implemented by means of various instruments of command, orders, naredenia, naredbe, commands, directives, and instructions. They can be issued only by superior officers and not by command staffs, administrations, or other group structures," unquote. This passage made clear to young officers that the command structure should not be confused with who has control. A subordinate officer could only get his instructions from a superior officer. The former commander of British forces, General Sir Richard Dannatt, discusses this concept or model of command in his expert report. It is based on the Soviet model and is favored by armies that rely on conscripts. As he says in paragraph 28 of his report, quote, "It is a system particularly well understood by those brought up in a communist or state-controlled society. The flexibility it gives to subordinate commanders, especially at the lower levels of command, is limited," unquote. Slide 3 depicts the same principle from the perspective of the commander. Quote, "The commander shall command and control subordinate units and institutions within the scope of the responsibility received. All authority was derivative. In the context of the VRS, as General Dannatt will describe when he gives evidence, in the context of the VRS, this principle required senior commanders of the Army to set out with precision the tasks to be taken by the troops under their authority." Pictured on slide 4 is an excerpt from General Dannatt's report. In it, he draws conclusions as a result of his experience, his expertise, and his review of the relevant documentation. Quote, "General Mladić was the commander of the main staff of the Bosnian Serb Army, VRS, the top level of command responsible for the actual planning and conduct of the conflict at the military strategic level," unquote. He continues, and I point out that this is from a military perspective. The reference here is to military responsibility and not to criminal responsibility. General Dannatt states, "The fundamental point is that while tasks can be delegated, overall responsibility can never be delegated." The fact that Mladić asserted effective command over his troops will be borne out in the evidence in this case. Slide 5 that is now before you contains the evidence of Piers Tucker, military assistant to the commander of UNPROFOR forces. He had regular contact with VRS personnel at all levels, including Mladić. And he has testified, quote, Lieutenant General Mladić barely made any effort to conceal the fact that nothing could or would happen in Bosnian Serb-held BH without his specific approval. It was very apparent that he made all the practical military decisions that mattered, unquote. The prosecution will also establish this with concrete examples of Mladić giving orders directly to the people who would carry out the criminal acts. Here on slide 6 is an excerpt of an intercept from the 28th of May, 1992, in which Mladić is directing the artillery fire of one of his gunners. The conversation goes as follows. Mladić first tells the gunner, "Shoot at Velicici, Velicici." The gunner replies, "Velicici?" Mladić affirms, "Velicici." Vukasinović, the gunner, responds, "Yes, sir." Mladić continues, "Shoot at Velicici and also at Pafalaci. There is not much Serb population there. Shoot there, around Dobrovolčačko, up there around Humska." The gunner seeks to confirm, around Humska. Mladić says, "At that Juraj Đaković street up there, and apply artillery reconnaissance so that they cannot sleep, that we drive them crazy." I would ask Ms. Stewart to play the audio of this file, and I would ask the booth not to interpret the voices into English so that we can all hear Mr. Mladić in his own voice.
Razumem. Velesić je tuci i poslali će tuci, samo nema srpskog življa mnogo. Da. Tuci ono oko one Dobrovoljačke, oko one Humske gore. Oko Humske. I Đure Đakovića gore. Razumem. Jel ti jasno? Razumem. Ali vidi na artiljerijsko osmatranje, da ne mogu da spavaju, da razlučimo pamet njihovu. Razumem.
Mr. Groom, this was not translated into French. Now, it's not evidence, therefore it's maybe less important. There are some problems anyhow with your speed of speech when you're reading, so would you please slow down? And unless the defense would take a different position that this has not been, it's written down in English on our screens, I take it that your slides will be available to the defense anyhow.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes. Then under those circumstances, not hearing evidence at this moment with an opening statement, I would just proceed and invite you to do so.
Quote, "Drive them crazy," unquote. Mladić's intent to terrorize the people of that Muslim neighborhood is manifest when we see the words he used when directing artillery fire into it. Mr. McCloskey has already set out the evidence establishing how Mladić exercised his authority to perpetrate the massacres in Srebrenica. The prosecution will establish, with credible and reliable evidence, that Mladić exercised his command authority to plan and order and to participate in the crimes set out in the indictment. Turning to the second pillar of the prosecution case, Mladić's knowledge that his orders were carried out, that the crimes he intended were in fact committed. Slide 7 is another entry from his notebook, made less than 2 weeks after he ordered the mass execution of men in Srebrenica. Here in his own hand, he records a meeting with Slobodan Milošević and General Momčilo Perisic, chief of the General Staff of the Yugoslav Army. He records Milošević as telling him, quote, "Srebrenica and Žepa have damaged us greatly," unquote. A clear reference to the growing international outrage at the information coming out of the takeover of 2 safe areas and the mass executions that took place in the aftermath. This next slide contains another example of Mladić recording in his notebook information about crimes. The entry now on the screen is from the 14th of October. Here he records Momčilo Krajiznik telling him, quote, Bogosha, the intervention platoon, demolished the hotel. They are raping everyone indiscriminately. Commander Miladin, they plundered everything in Bogosha, unquote. The prosecution will produce ample evidence that Mladić was well aware of the crimes his troops were committing and that he intended them to commit such crimes. Again, turning to the Danit report here on slide 19, he addresses this issue. Quote, senior commanders like Mladić and Krstić, whose careers I have studied, were professional officers with formal military command and staff training. In short, the VRS was an organized, coherent, and disciplined war-fighting body. Reports flowed properly upward and downwards within the Army, enabling commanders to make well-informed decisions, unquote. On slide 10 before you now is another report from the 1st Krajina Corps. Here the author states, quote, one thing is certain. We are already starting to feel the cost of the needless spilling of Muslim blood, unquote. A candid assessment that not only are Muslims being killed needlessly, but that such needless killing was against Serb interest. Your Honors, the crimes described in the indictment happened not only because Mladić planned and ordered these crimes, but because his subordinates were willing participants. Over the course of the war, they perpetrated similar crimes against many non-Serbs, sometimes using the same modus operandi. VRS soldiers knew how Mladić waged war, and they knew they were expected to employ his methods. His use of his position of leadership to commit crimes and allow the commission of crimes by soldiers who looked up to him was not only an inexcusable moral failure and a failure of leadership, but it constituted encouragement for the commission of crimes. With respect to Srebrenica, Mladić has offered the defense of alibi. On the 23rd of January this year, Mr. Mladić filed alibi notice. In paragraph 6 of that filing, the defense asserts that Mr. Mladić was not in a position to commit or aid and abet in the commission of any crimes between 14 and 17 July 1995. He asserts that he left for Belgrade on the afternoon of the 14th, attended meetings with international negotiators on the 15th, and then attended a wedding celebration on the 16th. He asserts that because he was not in the Srebrenica area during some of the mass executions, he was, quote, not in a position to commit or aid and abet in the commission of the alleged crimes charged in the indictment for 14 through 17 July 1995, unquote. The prosecution accepts as true that he was in Belgrade, that he left Srebrenica on the 14th of July, attended several meetings on the 15th, meetings with the Serb leadership and with international negotiator. The prosecution accepts as true that he attended a wedding and that he visited the military hospital. The prosecution does not accept that he was unaware of what was taking place. The prosecution does not accept that he was, quote, not in a position to commit the alleged crime, unquote. Prior to leaving Srebrenica, Mladić put into motion, under the control of subordinate officers, the large-scale, well-organized operation that would murder over 7,000 men and boys within a few days and forcibly remove over 30,000 women, children, and elderly men from the territory. On the 15th of July, 1995, the killing operation in Srebrenica was moving forward at full throttle. On that day, Mladić met with a number of international representatives. In between two of his meetings, General Rupert Smith and General de la Prelle had a separate discussion with Mladić. Mladić wrote down what General Smith said to him during that discussion. What he records as point 4 of what Smith told him relates to what was happening in Srebrenica. It is shown on slide 11. Quote, treatment of the population in Srebrenica and Žepa. There are rumors about atrocities, massacres, and rape, unquote. Mladić, in his own hand, recorded that General Rupert Smith informed him of rumors about atrocities, massacres, and rape being committed in Srebrenica. What did Mladić do? He went to a wedding the next morning. We have pictures of him at the ceremony and the party afterwards. The fact that Mladić was in Belgrade when these men were murdered does not mean he did not intend the men to be murdered. It does not mean that he did not initiate the killing operation. It does not excuse him of his criminal responsibility for ordering and setting in motion this massive killing operation. On the very day that Mladić attended the wedding, at the very time that this picture was taken, on that day alone, over 1,500 men and boys were being murdered at Branjevo Farm. The other picture on the screen now is from the exhumation of that site. While Mladić is seen here smiling, celebrating a wedding, all the time knowing that innocent men were being murdered as he did. During this trial, you will also hear of General Wesley Clark's conversation with Slobodan Milošević a few weeks after Srebrenica, when Clark questioned Milošević regarding whether he had as much influence over the Bosnian Serb Army as he said. Clark posed the following question to Milošević. He said, quote, Mr. President, you say you have so much influence over the Bosnian Serbs. But how is it then, if you have such influence, that you allowed General Mladić to kill all those people in Srebrenica? Unquote. General Clark recounts what Milošević told him. Quote, well, General Clark, I warned Mladić not to do this, but he didn't listen to me, unquote. Milošević acknowledged to General Clark that he had spoken to Mladić either before or during the massacres, that he warned Mladić not to do this, but that Mladić didn't listen. The fact that Mladić went to meetings and a wedding during the time the crime he ordered was taking place does not absolve him of responsibility for it. As General Dannett points out in his report, command and responsibility cannot be separated. Today, Mr. Mladić is protected by the presumption of innocence, a protection that remains with him over the course of the entire case and throughout the Chamber's deliberations. Today, I give the commitment of the prosecution to the trial chamber and to Mr. Mladić that the prosecution will prosecute its case against Mr. Mladić in a fair and balanced way. The next time I address you about the evidence in this case will be at the end of the trial. During that time, the Chamber will have heard the evidence presented by the prosecution and any evidence Mr. Mladić wishes the Chamber to consider. At that time, when I come before you again, I will ask that you give the people of Bosnia what they have waited so long for. To give all people of Bosnia, be they Bosniak, Croat, Serb, or just Bosnian, to give them the truth about what Ratko Mladić did to that beautiful and complex land, to give them the truth about what Ratko Mladić did to Bosnia's people. Your Honors, the prosecution will be ready to call its first witness when the Chamber so directs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Groom. This hearing was scheduled to hear the opening statement. Nevertheless, if there's any urgent matter one of the parties would like to raise, they have an opportunity to do so, although it was not scheduled. But Mr. Groom.
Not from the prosecution, Your Honor.
Mr. Lukic.
A bit caught by surprise, Your Honor, but I think that urgent matters we should discuss in the afternoon during the 65th meeting.
Yes, but I didn't know whether any other thing had
nothing
come
else.
up.
No.
Of course, it's clear that that matter is still pending. Now, before we adjourn, I would like to address a few matters. This will not take very long. First, on the 10th of May of this year, the defense informally requested the Chamber's permission to allow a qualified legal assistant to conduct the cross-examination of witnesses. On the next day, the 11th of May, the Chamber granted the defense request. The defense request and the Chamber's decision are hereby put on the record. I'll now deliver a statement on the start of the presentation of the prosecution's evidence, which was originally scheduled to begin on the 29th of May 2012. In light of the prosecution's significant disclosure errors, which the Chamber has addressed briefly yesterday, the Chamber hereby informs the parties that it has decided to suspend the start of the presentation of evidence. The Chamber is still in the process of gathering information as to the scope and the full impact of this error. The Chamber aims to announce the start date for the presentation of the prosecution's evidence as soon as possible. And this concludes the Chamber's statement on the matter. In view of this statement, we will adjourn, but sine die, the parties will be informed about when we will proceed. We stand adjourned.